A few months ago, I released a video in which I argued that the Fujifilm X100VI is the best camera on the market right now for its size. And the question was not really about if, but the question was when Sony would release a camera that would falsify that exact argument. And that's exactly what they did in a recent press release when they announced the Sony R1 R3. The name reminds me a bit of mathematics in high school, but that camera is smaller than an X100VI, and yet it features a 61 megapixel full frame sensor and a 35mm f2 lens. How did they do that, and is this RX1 R3 effectively a Fujifilm X100VI Killer? That's what we try to find out in today's video, and as you will see, the answer is much more nuanced than just APS-C versus full frame. So I would say, let's get into it. So let's have a look at the spec sheet of the RX1 R3, and you can see that they have indeed built in their highest resolution 61 megapixel full frame sensor. We already know from the Sony A7R5 and the A7CR. Additionally, this camera builds on a 35mm f2 Zeiss lens, and compared to the X100VI, image quality can be reasonably expected to be quite a bit better, because first of all, you're going to have more resolution from that 61 megapixel sensor, you will have slightly more background separation at the same aperture value, and you will also have better low light performance and dynamic range from this 61 megapixel full frame sensor. And all of this in a package that weighs 498 grams compared to 521 grams on the Fuji X100VI. How did they do that, and where did they make compromises in order to achieve such a small package? So effectively, in order to keep the size and the weight of this camera as small as possible, they have first of all decided to put in only a fixed screen. And those who have watched a few of my videos from the Fuji X100VI know that the screen mechanisms that is used in this camera is also not necessarily my favorite, because while it tilts horizontally up and down, it doesn't tilt vertically, and I really like to go low and shoot like vertical compositions, or really high up and shoot vertical compositions, and it doesn't really work. I can't see what I'm doing. But on the RX1 R3, you have a fixed screen, so there is nothing that moves. Like, you cannot shoot from a low angle and see your screen at the same time. Or you cannot shoot from a high angle and see your screen at the same time. There is nothing that moves, and I understand it, because having a screen that doesn't tilt, doesn't have a tilt mechanism, means that it can be even more compact. And I think it also tells something about the target audience of this new Sony camera, which is people who just want to document their life. So nothing very artistic where you have to go like super low or super high. And I mean, it sucks, but I do understand why they have chosen this screen mechanism. But compared to an X100VI, where you have at least a two-way tilt screen horizontally, it's a bit of a downgrade. The next feature they have omitted on the RX1 R3 is actually a bit more significant, because this camera does not have any kind of stabilization. So there is no IBIS in the camera or OIS in the lens, again as a reason to keep this camera as small as possible. And honestly, when I see this camera, I have absolutely no clue how they would even want to fit an IBIS unit into that camera. So that means that you're gonna have shakier footage if you shoot video. That also means that there is only limited leeway to do longer exposures. I think that on a 35mm lens, you should be able to handhold like 1/30th of a second, especially since the RX1 R3 has a leaf shutter built into it, so there is no added vibrations introduced into your shot from the shutter mechanism. So I think you can go low, but not long exposure low, like 1/4 of a second or even half a second, as you could, for instance, on other Sony or Fuji cameras or on this X100VI. And then finally, and honestly, I couldn't quite believe that they have omitted this from such an expensive camera. We'll talk about the price in a minute, by the way. But this camera, the RX1 R3, is not weather sealed, apparently, which I find crazy, because I mean, an everyday camera, in my opinion, should be weather sealed, because every day means that it's also probably going to rain at some point, unless of course you live in the Gran Senora Desert. Does that even exist outside of GTA? Let me know in the comment section down below. But when it doesn't rain somewhere, of course, you might not need weather sealing. But even in these desert-like conditions, having some protection, for instance, from sand or dust reaching your sensor, especially in a fixed lens camera where dust might be an issue, is not necessarily something I would like to have. And on my X100VI, I have weather sealing if I put an additional weather sealing ring in front of the lens. And this really truly makes the X100VI a great camera, and a camera that you can literally use for everyday stuff, even when it rains. And I have found that some of my best photos from this camera have been taken when the weather was the absolute worst. So having this peace of mind and just the ability to even go out in these conditions and shoot, you can do on an X100, but sadly, apparently not on the new Sony. And maybe that still changes, but I have two trusted sources that both confirmed that this camera is not weather sealed. So I don't know. So is this new RX1 R3 a real X100VI killer? Well, that depends on the type of photographer that you are. For image quality purists, this is arguably a dream come true. Uncompromised image quality in a body the size of a Micro Four Thirds cameras. But for creative minds who like versatility and features, this is not necessarily the camera for you, because the screen that doesn't flip makes it awkward to shoot from high or low angles. There is no IBIS, so you can forget about handheld long exposures. It's not weather sealed, which is arguably my biggest concern, which means that you're stuck with shooting in good conditions only. And of course, these are only my thoughts without factoring in the high price, which also completely alters the balance. In my opinion, photography and gear is not just about technical image quality, but it's also about what the camera actually lets you do. Where, in my opinion, the X100VI is the absolutely clear winner. But of course, it also depends on how much importance you give to technical image quality and to having the best autofocus on the market, which Sony definitely gives you, and that might also completely alter your thoughts. So one can clearly see that Sony has prioritized to get this camera as small as possible, like really as tiny as possible, while still retaining a 61 megapixel full frame sensor and a reasonably bright lens. So I understand that choice, it's definitely a choice, and I know that there is a few people who would actually love to get exactly such a camera, if they can afford it. I personally love that Sony has released this camera because it shows that there is some innovation behind it and really this push to build highly capable but super small cameras, which is really an approach that I absolutely support. So I hope that this little preliminary comparison between this new Sony release and the Fuji X100VI was kinda useful, and I hope to see you in next week's video. So stay tuned and see you soon. Bye.